Hello and welcome to the listening series. Today we talk to Professor Mushfiq Mobarak. Professor Mushfiq Mobarak is an economist and teaches economics at the Yale University. He belongs to the top 7% of the most cited economists across the world. He's also the founder and director of the Yale Research Initiative on Innovation and Scale. Welcome to the show, Professor Mushfiq.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Professor, I want to obviously start the discussion by talking about COVID-19. COVID has impacted the world economy the most in recent decades. How do you look at the world economy today in 2021, and where are we headed from here?
Right. Okay, so let me maybe just begin by giving some data that we've been collecting on exactly how this pandemic has hit the world economy. So, and then we can talk about, what the future might hold. So the first thing I want to point out is that the effects on, especially in developing countries and in poor populations living in low and middle income countries, has been simply staggering. Right? So something that we, partly because of lack of data, we haven't paid much attention to, is that, in the US, or UK, Europe, through administrative records, you can quickly get a sense of what's happening to the economy, right? But now in, say, in a low and middle income country where large parts of the economy is informal, right? Correct. It's not easy for us to just rely on official records to get a quick picture, right? So therefore, what I at Yale did, but along with others, Innovations for Poverty Action, faculty at Berkeley, right? We all started collecting data immediately, like starting in April of 2020, where we started directly making phone calls to people in rural areas of developing countries to try and understand, what the economic impact of the shock has been. And here we should also point out, because this is often gets confused, that when we start looking at the economic effects, right, it's not easy for us to distinguish between, say, the effects of the virus, right, the public health, versus the effects of our policy responses to the virus. The effects are kind of the sum of everything that's happening. Okay? And what you find is that the staggering effects, so just as an example, across like 15 different samples we're studying in countries as varied as like Sierra Leone, Rwanda, Ghana, but then in South Asia, Nepal, Bangladesh, India, Philippines, and then in South America and Colombia, across all these countries, really large and sudden drops in income and employment opportunities that put to shame, the types of drops that we had seen, say, during the Asian financial crisis in 97, 98, or during the Great Recession in 2008. Okay? And so large, so for example, 70% of people in the median sample is reporting drops in income. Okay? Further, you might say, okay, if it's a temporary shock, right, that even though you have drops in income, people might be able to somehow adapt and smooth their consumption, right? Do you rely on loans, or you rely on government support, or you rely on your own savings, right? So of course that happens somewhat, but it hasn't fully sort of insured the shock. So 45% of people in the median sample was also reporting that they have heightened levels of food insecurity, meaning that they're having to cut back on meals or reduce portion sizes, etc. And in spite of that, only 11% of people in the median sample is telling us that they were receiving some NGO or government support to deal with the crisis. A third of them lost access to markets, right? So the effects have been tremendous. Okay, so now going forward, what do we think? Okay, again, I'm focusing a lot more on developing countries than rural poor populations, because this is what's least discussed and least known about, right? I feel like I should pay more attention to that, because nobody else is. Maybe not nobody else, but fewer other people are. And there, the primary worries I have is that in responding to food insecurity, right? So people are rationally responding by trying to protect that type of consumption, like food consumption, like the basic necessities, as much as they can. And you see this in data from India very clearly, where they have detailed records from the consumer, like this pyramid survey that's been done, that's tracking households across India. And you see that, like all categories of consumption are going down, but food is most protected, is going down the least. Okay. But then we have to then worry about, okay, if people are protecting food, what is it that they're not spending money on? What are they reallocating from, right? So if they are reallocating from investments, okay, then that can have persistent effects on the economy. So what do I mean by investments? In rural India, you might think, in expenses on fertilizer or agricultural inputs, right? Those are the things that are going to be first to go rather than food. Okay? And so if that goes down, then that might have adverse effects on agricultural productivity going forward, right?
Right.
Or you also see that educational expenses are going down, right? And if you're not investing in children, that's going to have persistent productive effects for the next generation as well. Right? So those are the types of worries that I have, where we have to start thinking carefully and looking carefully in the data on what is being lost and what the persistent effects of that might be, and what types of policy responses we should have to those types of losses.
Which global trends, according to you, will shape the world economy in the next 10 years?
So I think, I mean, again, I'll stay with the pandemic, but then there's
Yeah.
probably like pre-pandemic global trends for us to talk about as well, right? But to stay with the pandemic, I'm trying to infer. I don't know for sure, but I'm trying to infer what is it that might be persistent effects. Okay? So people are learning to live differently and work differently, right? So I think those are trends that are emerging. So, for example, a lot of us have learned how to work from home and how to be productive in a very different setting, right? And there's been increased use of technology in order to communicate with each other, for teaching, for to conducting business, right? So I suspect those are going to, some of that, like it will come back a little bit, but not like completely back to the pre-pandemic normal, right? So some of those changes in behavior will persist, because we've learned something about ourselves in the process, right? And that would also mean, trends like, how what's happening to the airline industry or the hotel industry, et cetera, especially in like areas that used to hold professional gatherings, right? I suspect some of those things will be persistent as well.
Talk a little bit about your massive work and research around Amazon rainforest in Brazil, because that's also been a conversation in circles in the last couple of years. And why do you think deforestation is difficult to prevent through regulation alone?
Yeah. Okay. So let me maybe try to explain what we've found in the work, where based on large sample data, I can stand behind, and then we can talk about
Yeah.
reasons. Yeah. So, deforestation. So first of all, it's an extremely important problem, right? Anything that I think climate change is the existential risk that humanity faces, right? And we all need to be looking seriously at all aspects of climate change, including like different sources of emissions and different sources of carbon, and what we can do to control carbon emissions, our consumption, our behavior, the nature of work, the nature of how we produce, the nature of production, because we all need to take seriously this existential threat.
Mhm.
And I hope one of the persistent effects of this pandemic, if I'm being optimistic, is that it's become a lot more real to people in a way that it wasn't before 2020, that there can be global crises that immediately affect our lives in ways that we cannot even imagine, right? And climate change is one such thing that was very difficult for us to imagine what a big change in the world might look like. And now it's easier for us to imagine those things, right? Um, so, so what we, so going to Brazil and the Amazon, so we looked at a particular episode which happened over the second half of the 20th century in Brazil,
Mhm.
which is massive expansions of electrification across the country, and electrification not only in the coasts of Brazil, but into more rural and agricultural areas. Right? And with that electrification, we observed that there was a big productivity gain, right? Which is farms get electrified, and so now you have access to like use of lots of electrified technologies that changes productivity. And Brazil does two things. So one is agriculture, right? It's one of the top producers of soybeans, sugarcane, maize, etc. Right? And the other thing that is one of the top producers of is meat, like beef. Okay? So it does both beef production as well as agriculture. And one of the first things we noticed in the data on the second half of the 20th century is that the electrification, wherever it was expanded, right, that was a much bigger productivity benefit for crop production rather than beef production. And because there's very limited use of technology or any kind of confinement or anything in Brazil for cows, right?
Correct. Yeah.
So what that meant was that farmers who were now, the farms were, they were allocating some of their land to beef production, some of their land to various crop production, right? That's true within farm, but that's also, of course, true within county, but across farms, right? And what you see is that as a result of this productivity shock, farmers start moving much more into crop production, right? That becomes more and more um, popular as a livelihood strategy. Okay? And when that happens, okay, the second, the other fact that's clear in the data is that crop production is not as land intensive as beef production, right? So even though half of all agricultural land in Brazil is allocated towards meat production, it only accounts for like something like in the teens, like over 10%, but around maybe less than 15% of the total value coming out of that sector. Okay. So it uses 50% of the land, but producing less than 15% of the value. Right. And so here's a kind of a good news that happens sort of accidentally, which is that as farmers experience this productivity shock in agriculture, they move into it, right? And they are able to then allocate less land to agricultural work, right? And still get value, right? Because it turns out that you don't have to allocate as much land. Okay. So their demand for land goes down. Of course, it could have happened that they start doing more of everything, right?
Correct.
But it turns out that farmers are constrained. So, I mean, it's not just land, but they're credit constrained sometimes or capital constrained, which means that they don't do more of everything. They kind of reallocate, right? And so thankfully, like when farmers start moving into agriculture and that's less land intensive, that ends up being good news for the forest, right? Because now you're producing more things, allocating less land, and you're having to use less land, and the forest can regrow, right? Or you have to cut down a little bit less, right? Having said that, like that was, I mean, so that's why do we do this research and why does this matter? Like it helps us learn about what productivity shocks or productivity gains will do for environmental protection. And here's some good news where with some productivity gains, with some technology adoption, right, we actually end up saving the environment, right? That may not always be true in every circumstance, in every context, right? But I think there's like technology adoption by farmers is one possible pathway towards environmental protection. Okay. So what other technologies can we think of? So for example, in other countries, not in Brazil, right, there is a lot more use of confinement of cattle, right? And then you end up like there's something called rotational cattle grazing, right? You have
Are you talking specifically about South American countries or countries in general?
so that particular example is from Brazil, the rotational cattle grazing, which is having like electric fences, right? That might that allows you to limit exactly where the cows are going into and not having to cut down, and clear the forest, right? But similarly, but like there might be analogous examples in other settings outside of South America, right? Where we can, encourage technology adoption in farming, right? Raise productivity, and as a way of raising productivity, we can end up protecting the environment by creating more food in a more limited land area, right? So here's the so this gets into like conversations around say GM crops, right? Where I think it's actually more on the left, right, that people are much more worried about at least in the United States, the people are much more worried about these technologies. Okay? So here's how I think about it, where as an economist, I mean, not as somebody who has a political left or political right orientation. So you have 7-8 billion people on Earth. They have to be fed. So there's some quantum of food that you need in order to feed 7 billion mouths. Right? And we can't get around that. Right? The 7 billion is there and we have to feed them. Okay. So now the question is, like, how do we feed them? So there's some quantum of calories that need to be produced. Right? If we can produce those calories more efficiently using less land, right, that must be a good idea for environmental protection. Okay, and if GM crops are a way to get there, if it actually increases productivity, right, then saying we hold back that technology because of some other concern, right, that will have cost. So maybe that concern is real, right, and we need to think about that carefully. Right? But we do need to think about that carefully because it has limiting production, limiting use of the technology has a huge cost, including a big environmental cost. Right? And so therefore, scientific data on these concerns around GM, people should be paying attention to that scientific data as well.
Professor, how can we be better informed during our purchasing decisions or life in general around the economic impacts of our decisions?
Yeah, so I think we, like as the climate change problem shows at macro scale, right? We are probably not paying sufficient attention to the environmental ramifications of our outcome, of our purchasing decisions and our consumption decisions, right? Because I mean, this is a simple concept from economics, externalities, right? So when we make a decision on purchase, we think about what are the benefits, our private benefits from the purchase, and what are the costs that we have to pay. Okay.
Right.
And sometimes we impose an environmental cost, an external cost on others when we make that purchasing decision. And humans, by their very nature, are not going to pay attention to those external costs, right? Unless we are made to.
Yeah.
And how do you make somebody pay attention to the external costs? So just as an example, every time I take a airplane ride, right, it contributes to climate change because of the carbon emissions, right?
Yeah.
Now, if there was a tax on carbon, right, such that airplane rides get more expensive, right, then that forces me to take that into account because now airplane rides are more expensive, and I might end up choosing a very different type of vacation plan because a long airplane ride has gotten more expensive. Right?
So you're suggesting that this can only happen via regulations.
So this is a case where, so carbon tax, it's a very specific type of regulation, right? So this is a case where I think it's important. I mean, it's important for us to make sure that consumers are informed about the environmental ramifications of their decision making, right?
Mm-hmm.
But just making them informed and relying on their own goodwill to do the right thing, I don't think is sufficient. Right?
Okay. Makes sense.
But it doesn't mean like, so for example, if I want people to stop eating some fish that's being overfished. So this is now, I'm talking about another project in Chile that I've done with the Chilean government, right?
Yeah.
You see that it is valuable for us to run information campaigns and explain to people, this fish population is about to collapse, right? And especially in September when the fish reproduces, you shouldn't eat it. And when you tell people that, they actually do respond. But on the other hand, a lot of people continue eating the fish, and it becomes important for us to also impose some restrictions on the fish vendors and the fishermen, right, in order to get further decreases in that illegal behavior and protection of this important resource for future generations.
Yeah. Since long, also there is a popular notion that immigration is bad and it eats into local jobs. What is your research around that, and if are there any economic benefits or demerits to the whole immigration topic?
Yeah. So here I will refer to research by hundreds of authors. So this is an important enough topic and a policy, complicated policy decision that affects almost every country, right?
Mm-hmm.
Either recipients of immigrants or sender of immigrants, right? And as a result, like especially for countries like the US and countries in Europe, there's a ton of research now on what the economic effects of immigration are, right? And thankfully, I don't have to talk about my own work because in the US, the National Academy of Sciences, which is a premier sort of scientific body in the country, they sometimes convene panels to take stock of all of the research on a particular topic. And given how important immigration is, every 10, 15 years or so, they've had a panel that's looked at the economic effects of immigration. Right? So most recently it was done probably about 7 to 10 years ago, maybe about 6, 7 years ago. Right? And that panel reviewed somewhere between 600 and 700 studies, right, where they paid attention to the quality of the study and the quality of the data and the empirical inference, right, to try and get a sense of, okay, what is the literature across these 600, 700 studies telling us about the economic effects of immigration. Yeah? Mm-hmm. So imagine like doing a meta-analysis, but having the best scientific mind on the topic, like all reading the papers and coming up with the summary judgments, right? And that study and that panel included people who are very anti-immigrant, right? Like a professor at the Harvard Kennedy School who is, and also included people whose research have found much more positive economic benefits of immigration. Okay? So let me just summarize what they find. Okay? So number one, the the concern is, as you just pointed out in your wording, that immigrants come in and take away job of native workers, right? And so they put a downward pressure on the wages of native workers. Okay? So it turns out if you look across these dozens of studies on the effects of immigration on what happens to wages and employment opportunities of native workers, you end up getting the median estimate is like a bit of a zero effect. Okay? Like, why is that? In some places, immigrants have positive effects on wages of locals, and some places, some negative effects, but many places it's zero, and it's kind of centered around zero. Okay? Why would that be the case? Sure, immigrants come in and they are supplying labor, and they compete for jobs, right? But on the other hand, those immigrants are also consumers, right?
Correct.
And more importantly, now let me explain why it might have a positive effect. So imagine that there are, just to keep things simple, there's two types of workers. Okay, so some people who have some like local skills, right, and others who don't. Okay, so imagine like you're trying to run a restaurant. Okay, so you need people who are like customer facing, who can like be waiters and take orders, but you also need other people working in the back, right, washing dishes or cooking or something, right, or helping the chef or something like that. Right? Now, if you have a lot more workers, right, in the back, okay, that actually makes it more easier for you to actually run the restaurant business, right? Open up a restaurant and be profitable. Okay. And that ends up creating jobs for people who have those customer facing skills. So the native workers who have the right language skills, right? And so you'll see like a typical example of this is that New York City, you have a lot more restaurants, even though a lot more restaurant businesses than in, say, Oslo or other places that have fewer immigrants, right? Even though you have a lot more immigrants coming in. So that itself, like that observation teaches you, right? How is it that immigrants can actually contribute? They can actually be a complement to native workers. Okay? So number one is there are zero effects. And so now if there are downward pressure on wages, it turns out what the studies find is that those negative effects of a new wave of immigrants, it actually hurts the previous wave of immigrants the most, right? The immediate last group that came, right? Why is that? Because the new wave of immigrants that are coming in, they're more substitutable for the previous generation. They're not easy, they cannot easily substitute the native skills. Okay. All right, so that's on wages. Second, on economic growth, immigration, generally speaking, across in these research studies, has a positive contribution to economic growth. Why is that? Many studies have found, dozens of studies have found, that immigrants disproportionately contribute to innovation, the creation of new products and new markets. Right? The type of people who immigrate, right, happen to be more entrepreneurial and innovative, and they disproportionately represent like new business creation. Okay? And then one other final thing that the literature has worried about is the fiscal effects of immigration. So is it that immigrants come in and they just take a lot out of the system, right? They don't pay taxes, they just gain a lot of benefits because these immigrants are just like low productivity people who live off of others' work, right? It turns out that when you look at the fiscal effects of immigration, it's true in that in the first 5 years, right? They put more pressure on like taking benefits out more than they pay in taxes. But if you take a 10 or 15-year view, right, the situation reverses. The immigrants are, on average, in the long run, are more productive, right, and pay more in taxes than they take in benefits. Okay, and then when you look at, so especially studies that have looked at the children of immigrants, right, it's a completely different story. The children of immigrants are much more productive and much more tax-paying than the children of people who are non-immigrants, who are native.
Another popular notion in today's public discourse around job markets is that about automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, that it's going to eat up a lot of redundant jobs. How do you see that?
Yeah, I think that is an important concern. So we've observed these effects in the United States, and that has had wide-ranging ramifications on this country. Right? So the U.S., like let's say between the 1950s and 2000, right? There was huge gains in manufacturing in this country, right? Very large increases in manufacturing sector jobs, right? And then in the first 2 decades of this century, right, there have been huge declines in manufacturing jobs, right? So like a 17% decline in the first decade, followed by another 18% in the second decade. So like a third of the manufacturing jobs almost have been. The reason it's happening, and this is work by my colleague at Yale, Peter Schott, is the two bigger factors. It's not immigration. The big factors are international trade and automation. Yeah. And international trade. So basically, China entering the WTO, right, and opening up trade with China. So a lot of those jobs moved. So it's essentially disappeared because that production is happening elsewhere in the world where it's cheaper to have that production. Okay? And the second thing that's hit, like the Rust Belt areas of the United States. So this is areas that have historically done a lot of the car manufacturing, for example, is automation has been taking away some of those jobs. Okay. So now what do I mean by wide-ranging ramifications? So first of all, people lose jobs, right? But that then ends up changing their viewpoints on life, whether or not they can easily reskill to enter a new sector, right? And their views on who's to blame and the politics of the country, right? And if I were to overlay maps of exactly where those manufacturing sector job losses have occurred on the 2016 electoral map in the US, like the counties that voted for Trump rather than Hillary Clinton, right? You'll see a very clear spatial correlation, right, in those maps. Okay? So these have, so essentially, we are seeing around the world a rise in populism. That's true in the United States, but you've also seen this in the UK, right? You're also seeing this in Germany and other Western European countries, right?
Correct.
You're seeing this in India, right?
Big time.
In Hungary, in Eastern Europe. You also, in some ways, see this in China, where how the Han Chinese are treating Uyghurs, right? You see this in Burma, how the majority Buddhists are treating minority Rohingya and Muslim minorities in that country, right? And that populism has created this us versus them. We're trying to find someone to blame, and the them is the people who don't share a religious affiliation or a political affiliation with us, right? But like what's the people we might want to blame is actually robots.
Yeah. But also following up on the last question and the topic of welfare state, what are your thoughts on universal basic income?
So in the event that reskilling is difficult because there's sudden job losses, right? I think universal basic income, like direct cash transfers to people, have a very important and positive role to play, right? So this is something that we need to, of course, study and proceed with carefully. But all of the data that I have seen on the effects of direct cash transfers to people, right, generally have been very positive. And it is the case that like all of these, economic trends that we've been discussing for the last 30 minutes, right, that is creating a lot of inequality in the world, right? Just massive amounts of inequality that we also like almost without precedent, right? The amount of wealth concentration that's happening. Okay, and this is not sustainable. This is not sustainable in an ethical, moral sense. It's not sustainable in an economic or even a political sense, right?
Correct.
And we do need to find solutions to that, right? And universal basic income may be a part of that solution, but we also should be thinking. I mean, we shouldn't just like jump on that and say that, oh, that's the only solution. We also need to be thinking creatively about reimagining our economic systems such that the people who are at the wrong end of that inequality, their lives and livelihoods are better protected, right? And taxes, which is the traditional way of getting at it, right? Just because of like universal basic income, somebody has to pay for it, right?
Correct.
But any other transfers that we do, somebody has to pay for it. So we also need to rethink about our tax systems, and is it fair, equitable, right? And is it efficient, right? Efficient once you think about the political ramifications of all these decisions that's been.
Yeah. Companies like Uber, Airbnb, Amazon, all of them give you an increased variety to choose from. And what we have seen usually is that increased variety usually translates to increased demand and consumption. How does companies like Uber, Airbnb, Amazon impact economy in the wider scheme of things? And are there any side effects to this phenomena?
Sure. So the first thing is that on efficiency grounds, right, these types of innovations, right, these are very, very welcome. These are very positive, right? Mm-hmm. So here's what I mean. Like if you're only having to rely on a taxi, right? We've also already seen, like prior to Uber, Lyft, etc., coming in, right? That is a market that just didn't work well, right? Sometimes because of local politics, sometimes because of regulations and restriction on entry, right? We had a system that was very inefficient. It was very difficult to find taxis, that may have other ramifications, environmental ramifications, like everybody having to have a car, right? Okay. So you notice that these innovations are making things more efficient. So which is that, like, I have like a car, but like 35-40% of that car is not being utilized or underutilized, right? Because the car is like the number of hours that car can be on the road, right? And there's a lot of underutilization. And we are now, through a new innovation that connects riders to drivers, we are better utilizing that resource, right? Which should lead us overall to create less of that resource over time, right? In theory. So similarly, a house is sometimes underutilized, or a room in a house is being underutilized, and we can be more efficient by renting that out, right?
Yeah.
And we can rent it out. If we can rent it out in like small chunks and increments, right? Maybe that efficiencies that have benefits, both economic as well as environmental benefits. Right? There's nothing wrong with that. So I like those innovations. Okay? And second, I also want to point out that those innovations were possible precisely because our existing market and imperfect regulation of that market, or those market imperfections that come from monopoly behavior, etc., right, was, innovations, they had a room to come in and play that role precisely because that market wasn't working so well, right? So we can't just say, oh yeah, let's just continue with status quo, right? Because it hasn't been working. So now we have this new innovation, so a very new type of business that's emerged that we hadn't imagined before, right? The very fact that we hadn't imagined is why these companies are valued so much, and people have suddenly gotten that rich, right? But that also means that since we hadn't imagined it, we didn't have a regulatory environment that had thought carefully and in a sophisticated way about how to make this market work, right? So now in the tech industry, we have like very new ways of doing things and new ways of doing business, okay? And and regulation also needs to catch up, right? And regulations are there for a reason. So just as an example, like we have to rethink what it means, what antitrust means, right? Antitrust regulations are there to protect consumers, right? And we are now in a different economic environment when we have to understand how do we now protect consumers under this new technology environment.
Regulation for big tech, what do you think works for tech? More regulation or less regulation?
Okay, I'm definitely not going to play this game of giving a binary answer of more versus less, because the world is complicated. So here I'm going to be that type of an economist who has more than two hands, right? Or or not a one-handed economist. So again, like we have to go back to the basic principles, right? So there is some solid principles on which antitrust regulation is based, right? And that solid principle is that we understand from economic models that if you let companies like completely unregulated, they are going to make decisions that are to their benefit and sometimes to the detriment of consumers. Right? And it is the role of society. We set up our government in order to come up with regulations that protect consumers when the free market does not allow for that protection. Okay? So now we're in this new world where, again, Google, Facebook, etc., right? They are affecting our lives in ways that we hadn't imagined before.
Yeah.
Right. So and we're trying to figure out exactly what's happening, and we really do need sharp minds to think carefully about what is happening, how it's affecting us. Many people believe, right, that social media has outsized impacts on our political behavior, on our information environment, right? How we interact with each other, how we vote.
Yeah.
Okay. And possibly has an impact and creates opportunities for an actor to undermine the democratic process, right? By through technology, through technological tricks, through misinformation, etc. Right? Now, if that's going to be true, that affects our society, and our regulations need to catch up to try and understand the problem and then try and regulate in a way that actually addresses the problem or improves it.
Correct.
So I'm not going to start by saying, and maybe the possible, and maybe we learn from that careful thinking that yes, that's a problem, right? And regulation is actually just going to make things worse, or it's not going to work, right? And we have to reimagine regulation, right? I'm open to saying that, okay, yeah, there's some other way to think about this, right?
Correct.
Or for antitrust that, oh, yeah, you know what, breaking up Google into little pieces is not going to work the same way as breaking up like telecom companies did in 40 years ago or 50 years ago.
Those were all the questions. Thank you for taking the time out from your very, very busy schedule, Professor Mushfiq. I wish you the very best.
Okay, thank you, Rachit. This was fun.